Bienvenidos a Disrupt Everything, podcast series by Isra García. Reinvéntate a ti mismo y cambia lo que más te importa.
Let's jump in.
Let's jump in. Let's do it. I'm excited.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Today, as you know, as I'm talking in English, is because we have an international guest. Today, we are interviewing Paul Austin. We interviewed Paul Austin about psychedelics, microdosing, leadership, peak experiences, optimal performance, among many other things. Paul is a disruptor who, as Jason Silva says, has normalized psychedelic substances through the lens of microdosing, an agent of change that creates bridges between human potential and also a personal and professional transformation. Someone like Paul, who Stephen Kotler, one of the fathers of modern neuroscience, he says and quotes, he does a great job deconstructing and synthesizing things that are out of reach for most of us. A couple of years ago, my friend Eric told me about Paul as one of the most promising young world leaders in terms of evolutionary awareness, psychedelics, and personal transformation. Then, when I was at synthesis retreats, which I'm not going to tell you what it is, I will let Paul say so, of which Paul is co-founder alongside Martin's Dream. I was also able to find more about his work and also his fantastic team, of which my great friend Natasha Pelgrom is also part of lead facilitator. Paul is also and mainly the founder and manager of a CEO of Third Wave, a place of proven reference around the world of psychedelics and their impact on culture, society, human potential, and personal and professional development. There, Paul leads and teaches online educational programs like the one Becoming Superhuman, an LSD microdosing course, if I'm not wrong. Paul, who is Paul Austin, really? Paul is a specialist in using microdose of psychedelic substances as a super habits of improvement in capacities such as leadership, well-being, creativity, and easier access to flow states. His skills have led Paul to become an educator, entrepreneur, consultant, and also speaker. Recently, Paul has published his book, his first editorial work called Microdosing Psychedelics, a practical guide for upgrading your life. Paul has appeared in worldwide publications such as Rolling Stone, BBC, Forbes, New York Times, The Economist, or Business Insider. And people, as I said in the intro, Jason Silva, Stephen Kotler, or Gerard Adams has endorsed their work. Today, we're interviewing Paul about conscious living, the impact of psychedelics around us, and the role on development of human potential, and the power of microdose, and the power of this unleashing that human potential represents. A podcast which also addresses how to work at peak performance and offers lessons on leadership, creativity, and transformation that a change agent, and a change maker like Paul has drawn from such an eclectic life. First and foremost, how old are you, Paul?
How old am I?
Yeah.
I'm 29.
So then it comes to my next question. But by the way, first, before my first question, which I'm shooting so quick, thank you for being in Disrupt Everything podcast series, and thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Where are you? You're in Miami, right?
I'm in Miami at the moment. Mm-hmm.
Miami, I guess.
I love Miami. I mean, it's hot. It's warm. I came here because, with COVID, sun kills the virus, supposedly. So it was like, Miami's going to be a better place to ride this out. It's a little healthier and people are outdoors. People are sexy. It's fun. I like it here. It's a good spot.
Paul, with such an enormous curricula and also projects going on that you are leading, the first question that comes to mind, and which I'm going to start the podcast, is one I used to use for starting and shooting the podcast, and which is, if you were to put all your highlights in a timeline, how this timeline will look like? What will be your highlights, since you are conscious or you can recall to up to today?
That's a great question. So the first thing that comes to mind is when I was 16, I smoked cannabis for the first time. So that's highlight number one on the timeline. Highlight number two is when I did LSD for the first time when I was 19. So about 10 years ago. And those two experiences, basically, where I grew up, where I was raised, they were seen as very, they were illegal, and they were seen as being very not okay. So it was really interesting to have those experiences, to see outside the box a little bit. When I was 21, I moved to Turkey, and I lived in Turkey for about a year, and that's where I taught English and started to look into, Tim Ferriss's stuff, digital nomadism, building my own businesses, entrepreneurship. When I was 24, I started my first business, which was an online coaching school where I taught people how to speak better English for the TOEFL test, which is a test they would have to take to get their MBA at Harvard or, do anything like that. And then when I was 25, I started Third Wave, and when I was living in Budapest. And that really came about because I noticed that there was more and more psychedelic research coming out, that cannabis was becoming legalized, and that, there was just more and more acceptance of these substances. And Tim Ferriss started to publish podcasts on them about that point in time. So when I was 27, I started Synthesis with Martijn in Amsterdam. And then I would say those in some ways are the more professional highlights. Cannabis at 16, LSD at 19, moving to Turkey at 21, starting my first business at 24, starting Third Wave at 25, starting Synthesis at 27.
And how about your personal highlights?
Well, it's so interesting because my personal highlights are so intertwined with my professional work, right? Like these experiences for me. I mean, I fell in love with my first woman at 23. I fell in love again at 26. I fell in love again at 28. So I think those are all the big personal highlights are falling in love, what's better than love? Nothing at all. But these psychedelic experiences have been so profoundly insightful on a personal level that when I had those early experiences, really my focus was, how do I find the integration of the work that I want to pursue in the world and my personal values? It's if you read Robert Greene, who wrote Mastery and 48 Laws of Power and, The Art of Seduction, at the very beginning of Mastery, he talks about what it means to find your vocation in the world, right? What it means to find what you actually want to do. And he talks about how it's this process of going inwards, going inside, understanding more about yourself. And I feel like when I started to work with psychedelics, with intention, when I was 19 and 20, it was exploring a lot of my own inner worlds and understanding what are my personal values? What do I believe in most? Things like simplicity and taking care of the earth and traveling. And, I'm very curious. So reading and exploring and trying new things and generally disrupting, being chaotic sometimes. And those are those personal things. I was like, these are so important to me. And now how do I create a platform? How do I communicate this publicly so more and more people recognize the value of living simple and of traveling a lot and of doing the inner work, meditating, yoga, doing psychedelics, right? In our culture, we're so distracted by external things, right? TV, social media, girlfriends, whatever else it is. There's all these distractions that try to pull our attention away. And I think what psychedelics teach us is there's so much value in going inwards and listening to ourselves. And I think more than anything, that's what I've learned through this process is, how do I listen to myself?
And Paul, you said a key thing, which is all about I was figuring out how to integrate psychedelics into this world, right? And so what have you find and how? Yeah, what have you find on that integration? Because you've done quite a big and enormous brand ambassador work for integrating psychedelics into this world. So what's been your key findings and your what do you think are the keys in today's world? I mean, also in professional world. what's been your findings?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to pay attention to and honor is always meet people where they're at. So in other words, my mom, who's 65 and lives in the Midwest, is going to be in a different place than a 21-year-old who's at a Grateful Dead concert or at a music festival or whatever else. So I think that the key component with the integration of psychedelics is always listen, understand who you're speaking to, understand where their journey is at, and then simply give them an option or a choice to go deeper into that journey. Right. So for a lot of people, who aren't either struggling with deep clinical issues like PTSD, depression, addiction, or who are very young, like 19 or 20, a lot of people don't want to take the risk of drinking ayahuasca or going and doing mushrooms or, like totally losing their sense of self, right? Because it's very disrupting. It's very chaotic. It's very difficult sometimes to get the ego away. And that's why I focus so much on microdosing, right? Because microdosing is saying, okay, let's take the analogy of like a pool, right? Like when we learn how to swim, we always start in the shallow end of the pool. We always start where so the analogy of a pool, right? When we first learn how to swim, we go in the shallow end and we kind of have an instructor there, or, we're in a lake and we can touch the bottom and everything's very comfortable and water's very new, right? How do we move around in water, et cetera, right? And then as we become more comfortable with that process, we start to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, right? So I'd like to think of altered states in that way, whether that's microdosing or breath work or yoga or fasting or whatever else it is. There are various ways to alter our consciousness. And some of these ways are they're simpler, they're easier. And so that's sort of the shallow end. And then as we become more comfortable with going inwards and exploring parts of ourselves, we can go deeper and deeper and deeper, where then we can swim and do flips and turns and like all these really fun things. So I think that to me has always been the key of integration. Is this isn't a one and done process, right? It's not like we're just drinking ayahuasca or going to a synthesis retreat and it's like we do it once, it's done. The experience is done, boom. No, this is a practice, right? This is a practice of going inwards. This is a practice of listening to ourselves. This is a practice of cultivating reflection and awareness. And psychedelics can often be that sort of like catalyst to open us up. And we still need to, it's sort of like the Zen saying that after enlightenment, you still clean the dishes, right? So it's important that even after we have these big peak openings, if you will, that we go back, that we're meditating, that we're doing yoga, that we're flossing our teeth every single day. We go to the dentist every 6 months. Every single day we're brushing our teeth, we're flossing our teeth. So I think that's always the most important part with integration is how does this fit into someone's normal everyday life? And in terms of it coming in, how does it transform it from the inside out so that people live healthier, more vibrant, more connected lives?
My next question is how you treat the way that people and society is understanding, and how to behave, or how interact with the way people is interacting with psychedelics today, and in a society where more and more findings are coming up. John Hopkins opening facilities, the work you're doing in synthesis. How is this? How we can bridge these two worlds?
So the world of people who don't know a lot about psychedelics and
Exactly
what's going on. I think the most important thing to lead with is research, right? So when we're talking about the efficacy of psychedelics, it's really important that we emphasize how psychedelics have been used to treat PTSD, depression, addiction, because these are clinical issues that we don't have any really good solutions for at this point in time, right? And we've had a mental health crisis for a while, and with COVID, it's just getting worse and worse. So that's why it's so important that we continue to do more research on the efficacy of psychedelics to treat clinical issues. And for that reason, a lot of people who might look down upon psychedelics or not be sure about psychedelics or think they're dangerous or harmful, when you talk about actually clinical research shows that MDMA can cure PTSD and psilocybin can cure depression. And, some of these things that makes all of a sudden people go, oh, well, if it's just used as a medicine in a clinic, it's not being sort of recreationally used, and that's totally okay. So I think that's one element. I think the other element is just general education around the war on drugs, and people understanding that, we have certain drugs that are legal and we have certain drugs that are illegal. And the drugs that are legal are caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, cannabis now in some places, opiates, pharmaceutical drugs, right? All of these are drugs and they're all legal. And then the drugs that are illegal are obviously like LSD and mushrooms and MDMA and DMT, right? All of these psychedelics. So I think it's really important that people understand that that's not scientific. It's political. There's the reason some drugs are legal and some drugs are illegal is nothing to do with what's more harmful or what's more addictive. It simply has to do with politics and other things like that. So I think coming to an understanding about all humans use drugs, and it's just a matter of how can we use drugs that actually support our well-being and that help us to become healthier and that help us to become more aware and that help us to cultivate self-reflection. Those are psychedelics. And oftentimes the drugs that numb us are alcohol and tobacco and obviously opiates and other things. So I think that's the way to think about drugs, is what helps us to be more alive, psychedelics, sometimes cannabis, but sometimes cannabis can also numb us. And then what drugs are sort of taking things away from us, or not helping us to live as vibrantly and as alive. So those are the two ways that I would think about it.
Thanks, Paul, for that explanation and also for giving us context to my next question, which is, for us, maybe it's too obvious, but for a lot of people know that I'm not into the psychedelics, ecosystem, but a lot of people ask, as I interview you, I interview Marta, and I Natasha, and one of the things that I really want to ask you is, what's the difference for newbies and not so newbies of psilocybin and LSD?
So psilocybin is a plant, or it's a fungi, I guess, but it grows in the ground. It's natural. LSD is a semi-synthetic, meaning that you need a lab to produce LSD, and it comes from ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye. So that's one main difference. The other main difference is mushrooms last about half as long as LSD. So if you have a mushroom trip, it's going to last about 6 hours approximately. If you have an LSD trip, it could be anywhere from 10 to 12 hours in total. So that's also something to be mindful of. I think the third thing to be aware of is LSD is more dopaminergic, meaning there's more dopamine that you get when you take LSD. So dopamine is tied to focus, it's tied to cognitive function, it's tied to sort of like energy and intensity. So that's why, like with LSD trips, I always love to go hiking and be outside and be moving and, things like that. Psilocybin mushrooms are much more serotonergic, meaning serotonin, the neurotransmitter. And serotonin is more tied to contentment, to feeling present. So mushrooms are much better to work through emotional things, to deal with sadness and anger and envy and various other emotions. Whereas LSD is much better for like creativity and brainstorming and all these other things. And in fact, that's why, from my perspective, LSD was so widely used in the 60s in places like Silicon Valley, and why Steve Jobs said, LSD was one of the most important things that he ever did. Because there's a really, really strong relationship between the introduction of LSD in the 50s and 60s in places like Menlo Park, which is where Stanford was, and the computer revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s. And I think that relationship is really interesting. So long story short, LSD, better for cognitive function, brainstorming, much more energy, kind of like a psychedelic coffee, if you will. Mushroom is much better to deal with emotional things, to be more present. There's more of a body load. You can feel it in the body a little bit more. So that's probably the two big differences.
Paul, next, so that's really interesting, and I like the idea of like a psychedelic coffee for representation for LSD, and it's you gave so much light to a lot of people who is asking us most of the time what is psilocybin about and LSD in a really short way. So I thank you for that. Uh, Paul, what's the science and art behind of microdosing, which is one of the things you are really, really deep into? I have to say that when I met Martin, I was doing a microdosing of LSD of 40 days every day. And now I just, like 1 month ago, I finished, like 15 days ago, I finished an experiment of macrodosing of psilocybin, 250 micrograms every 2 days. And I want also to ask you about the macrodosing thing, because I looked a lot for in the internet, but I have to say that navigating a macrodosing for 52 days, it was a hell of a ride, man.
You microdosed for 52 straight days?
A macro. No, but it was 1 day on, 1 day off.
Wow. That's intense. Really super intense.
Really intense. I mean, and doing, talks, meetings, like normal life.
What was that like, Isra? That's super interesting.
It was like sometimes I was laying on the sofa, like, completely into the journey, and then my mind said, okay, you are into the journey, but in 3 hours you have a meeting, man. So at the very beginning was a bit of, was this navigating, sometimes the sea is just a storm and sometimes it's quiet. So I felt like that, and as I went by from the 30 day and on, like my body start tolerating and regulating the macrodose. And I was getting deeper. I felt in the 52 days, I felt like I could go for 50 more days, but I didn't think it was an experiment. I was more like, I had to stop in the 52 days, but I felt like I could get deep into it more and more and more, because, like it was opening. It was open, like every day it was opening from the day 40 and on, because I was intent to do 40 days, but I saw the 40 days, what I was receiving. I said, okay, I'm going to go like at least 12 more days. But the thing of integrating your normal life while you are on a macrodose, I think is ultra interesting.
Yeah, I haven't tried that. I'll give a few details on microdosing. Should we go into that first? And
yes,
then
please.
once we go into microdosing, we can expand into macrodosing as well. So, microdosing was first talked about in 2011. There was a guy, Dr. Jim Fadiman, who wrote a book called the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and he had a chapter in there on microdosing where he was pretty much like, you'd heard from a friend that Albert Hoffman, who is the inventor of LSD, had tried microdosing back in the 70s and had experienced a lot of benefits from it. And so Jim basically sent, survey notes to a number of his friends and was like, hey, heard about this thing that Albert Hoffman tried, give it a go. And so people started taking small amounts of LSD 2 or 3 times a week, and they noticed like a number of benefits. And so when I heard about microdosing, it was in 2015. I was living in Thailand and building, my first business, and was really looking to microdose to help with 2 things. One was like flow and creative states. And the second thing was more around like social anxiety and feeling more connected to others. And so when I'd had my early macrodose experiences, I noticed that usually for like the week or 2 weeks after those experiences, I was more flowy and more open and more connected. And I also made better decisions about the food that I ate and the exercise that I did. I just had a much higher standard of self-care. And then, after a couple of weeks, it would start to dissipate a little bit, and I would take a few things here and there, but it would be back to, like, okay, this is where I'm at. This is my baseline. And so when I heard about microdosing, I wondered, oh, is microdosing a way to extend that afterglow, so that instead of just feeling more open and flowy and having a higher level of self-care for the week or 2 after, it actually is for a month or 2 months or 3 months. So I started experimenting with microdosing and did it about twice a week for about 7 months. and noticed that when it was timed well and when I did it with intention, that it really helped me with brainstorming and ideation and writing. And that generally, I've never been a huge drinker, especially over the past few years. I basically don't drink any alcohol at the moment. But in college, I drank quite a bit. And a couple of years after college, I would drink here and there. And essentially, when I started microdosing, I replaced alcohol with LSD. And so when I would have nights out with friends, nothing crazy, just going to a bar to hang out for a little bit, or going to dance or whatever it is, I would just microdose that day, and then I would feel much more connected and with people, more present when I was there. So the key thing with microdosing is just like you did, Isra. Actually, not just like you did. The key thing with microdosing is to take a day break in between each microdose. And the reason for that is because psychedelics have short-term tolerance. So, if you take a microdose on day one, then you have basically a 48-hour window of tolerance. So even if you microdose the next day at the same amount, you're not going to feel any different or any sort of change. So it's really better to microdose day one, allow the sort of afterglow to go into day two, take day three totally off, and then microdose on day four, and then allow the afterglow go into day five, and then take day 6 off, and then, repeat that cycle. And that's Jim Fadiman's cycle. And Jim Fadiman's cycle is more from my perspective, it's more clinical in nature. It's a cycle that allows people to get off their psychiatric medications, or to deal with depression, or to deal with addiction. And so that's one sort of protocol. The second protocol that I think your listeners would be much more interested in is the protocol that Paul Stamets has popularized, which is microdose 4 times a week. Day 1, yes. Day 2, no. Day 3, yes. Day 4, no, et cetera, repeating like that. And do it with microdoses of mushrooms. And what Paul recommends is do that with a combination of psilocybin mushrooms, lion's mane, which is a type of non-psychoactive mushroom, and niacin. And that combining those 3 together is sort of this, psychedelic nootropic that helps with cognitive function and focus and, immune function and all these other things. So that's more the schedule that I'm currently on. I microdose anywhere from 3 to 4 times a week. And I take a microdose of mushrooms with lion's mane and niacin. And I've been doing that consistently over the past few months. And to be honest, it's just sort of become part of my normal everyday routine. Just like I take fish oil and ashwagandha and probiotics and, creatine and whatever else it is, I'm now microdosed just as like a supplement more than anything.
So what's the difference between the protocol one, the first protocol, and the second one? What difference have you found? What's the distinction?
Yeah, great question. I think for protocol 1, like James Fadiman protocol, which is 2 times a week, I feel like that's best for LSD. And the reason for that is, as I was mentioning earlier in the podcast, LSD, it's a lot more energizing, and LSD is a really good antidepressant in particular. It has a really strong antidepressant quality. Now, the potential downside to LSD is if you start microdosing with it too much, it could start to create a lot of anxiety. So just like if you drink 3 or 4 coffees every day or 5 coffees every day, you're going to have lots of anxiety from that compared to just drinking oolong tea. So I see psilocybin mushrooms, as more comparable to like oolong tea, where it's nice, it's subtle, it's warm, it works, but it's not too intense. Whereas LSD is like a psychedelic coffee. It's really intense. So I think twice a week, again, James Fadiman, twice a week, LSD, much better for like depression in particular. I think Paul Stamets protocol 4 times a week is much better with mushrooms, and it's much better for like as a nootropic to help with cognitive function. I still struggle with anxiety from time to time, so it helps to ground me and to regulate my emotions so that I stay more grounded. And I see James Fadiman protocol, the 2 times a week, as being more something that, you do once or twice and then you're done with it. You don't go back to that. And I see Paul Stamets protocol as more of this is a consistent practice that you might be doing for the rest of your life. Just like you're going to take fish oil for the rest of your life, or just like you're going to, eat or intermittent fast, for the rest of your life. It's a practice. It's a ritual. It's a routine that is integrated into who you are.
I like the idea of seeing this as a ritual, as at the same level as probiotics or fish oil, as you said, or ashwagandha, or as doing push-ups, right?
Right.
What are the short, mid, and long term benefits for that?
Well, can we talk about, maybe we can talk about benefits, and then we can also talk about concerns or what people should be mindful of as well.
Exactly.
I think because that'll be a good balancing point.
For
I
sure.
think
Good suggestion. Yes.
The benefits, it's the thing that I always compare it to is like mindfulness meditation. Like, I don't know if you meditate. To be honest, I've been doing a lot more breath work lately than meditation, but like, I remember when I first started meditating when I was 19 and 20 and doing it consistently for like 20 minutes a day. After like a month, I noticed I'm much less reactive. My emotions are much more regulated. I'm much more present. I have better creativity. I'm able to focus better, et cetera, et cetera. So I really see microdosing as being similar to that. If you microdose 2 or 3 times a week over about a month to 6 weeks, you're just going to notice you have a little more energy, you have a little more creativity, you're a bit more grounded and present. It's easier to deal with difficult situations. I'd say those are some of the short-term benefits. The midterm benefits, I think, have to do with rewiring your neuroplasticity. So if we look at some of the research that's been done on psychedelics, we know that they can help with neurogenesis, which is essentially the creation of new neural pathways in the brain. And so that's why I think it's so important that people understand that microdosing is not a magic pill. We have this sort of, especially this probably isn't as true in Europe, but in the United States in particular, we really have this sort of mindset of, there's a pill for every ill. So if you're depressed, take Prozac. If you're anxious, take Xanax. If you're not horny, take Viagra. If you're whatever the fuck else, there's a pill for every ill. And I think the thing that we don't want to do with microdosing is use it like that. We don't want to think that microdosing will fix our problems, or we don't want to perceive microdosing as a solution to something. Instead, we want to see microdosing as part of a larger ritual or routine that helps us to generate more presence, to be more creative, to be more loving to ourselves, and in that process, to integrate new habits. So what we always talk about is when you start microdosing, how can you also start meditating? Or if you start microdosing, how can you start exercising more? If you start microdosing, how can you start to be more mindful of the food that you're eating and what you're putting into your body? And that, to me, I think is the real midterm benefit of microdosing is rewiring our habits so that we actually integrate new ways of being as a result of our microdosing routine and regimen. In terms of the long-term benefits, the thing that I like to focus on long-term is inflammation. So we know that chronic inflammation is tied to so many lifestyle diseases, obesity and diabetes and, heart issues and autoimmune disorders and depression and addiction, and just the list goes on, right? If you look at fundamentally what is sort of the substrata that all of these diseases of modern civilization are built on, it's chronic inflammation in the body. Now, inflammation generally is necessary, right? If you cut yourself, you need inflammation like acute inflammation as a response to that to heal. But when you're chronically inflamed, then cortisol is up and testosterone is down and stress is up, and it's harder to be present. So long-term, what microdosing can do is as well as fasting and high intensity interval training and float tanks and, high doses of psychedelics, is it helps to lower chronic inflammation in the body. It helps you to regulate your emotions better. It helps you to be less stressed. And I think that's the biggest long-term benefit from microdosing, which is why I talk about it as a supplement. Because just like you take fish oil to balance omega-3s to omega-6s, which again is tied to inflammation, we can microdose as well to help reduce inflammation so that we can live, with more energy and more vibrant.
And so you were saying also you want to address the concerns people might have about microdosing.
Yeah. So I think I addressed some of them in that last part, which is thinking that microdosing is a magic pill, right? And what that means to me is psychological dependency. So microdosing is not physically addictive, right? In fact,
That's
psilocybin is the
important. That's
least
really important.
addictive. It's really important to understand. Yeah, it's not physically addictive. So you can microdose and you won't have any sort of cravings or, addictive tendencies for it. What it can be is there can be a sense of psychological dependency. So in other words, as you start to microdose, you'll notice my mood is better. I have more energy. I'm more creative. And then what you'll start to do is, the only way I can be creative or the only way I can have more energy is if I microdose. Right? So we don't want there to be a dependent relationship. We don't want there to be codependency between microdosing and feeling better. And that's why I recommend, start meditating, start doing breath work, start eating healthier, because as you change your lifestyle habits, as you're microdosing, then you'll generally just start to feel much, much, much better, and you'll be less depressed and all those things. So I think one concern is psychological dependency. I think the other concern for people to be mindful of is anxiety. I think, and I'd be curious, Isra, to hear about this from you, what impact microdosing had, especially when you did it for 48 days straight, whatever you did. But what I've noticed personally, and what we've noticed with people who enroll in our microdosing course, is that sometimes if they start microdosing too much, or sometimes if life in general is quite stressful, then microdosing adds to that stress. It can make you more anxious. It can make you, sleep harder to come by, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the concerns or risks to be aware of with microdosing is to be mindful of anxiety, to be mindful of your energy, and to especially with LSD, because like I said, LSD is like a psychedelic coffee. So if you have insomnia, or if you already have generalized anxiety disorder, don't microdose with LSD. Always start with microdosing mushrooms.
Paul, for the people which is for everyone who is listening this podcast, I know that a lot of the community is really interested on microdosing, and trying, and because recently I've been asked like 30 or 40 times for different people on microdosing. So what will be your number three, your 3 steps to start with microdosing? What would you say to these people that are interested on microdosing, sorry, and how to start, and where to start?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is go to the third wave, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of resources on third wave
Finally.
About microdosing. Most of them are free. We also have a course where we go deeper into detail if that's something that people want to go deeper into. So I think first thing first is learn and educate yourself. I also have a book that I publish about this that people can check out. So always learn. I think the second step is, once you start, is to start low and go slow, is what I always say. And what that means is, microdosing is a gradual process. We're not trying to change our entire lives on day one. What we're trying to do is see incremental changes over a period of time. So if you're microdosing with LSD, start at 5 micrograms, go to 6 micrograms, go to 7 micrograms, go up to 8 micrograms, 9 micrograms, et cetera, and just slowly, bit by bit, increase the amount that you're taking. For psilocybin mushrooms, it would be start at 0.1 grams or 100 milligrams, go up to 110 milligrams, 120 milligrams, et cetera, et cetera. So start low and go slow is the second thing. And then the third thing is to look at microdosing as a process or a journey. Like I said before, this isn't you microdose on day one and your life is changed and transformed. This is we're microdosing consistently 2 or 3 times a week for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. And we're evaluating how does our baseline change from day 1 to day 30 or day 60. And how have we changed as a person as a result of our microdosing protocol? So I think those are the 3 most important things to pay attention to.
Which I think you have to have a baseline and KPIs for knowing where you are at and how you evolve, right?
Yeah, and I think those baselines can be 2 things. Those can be quantitative, meaning with numbers. So that could be psychometric data or psychometric testing that you put yourself through. That could be even something as simple as an Oura ring, which I'm wearing right now, which tracks and measures sleep quality and HRV. And people have this with Fitbit and the Apple Watch. There are various other like quantitative, you could do blood testing. So go to the doctor, get blood withdrawn and put it through, what's your cortisol level, what's your testosterone, what's, all those sorts of things. You can see your cholesterol levels, all those sort of numbers, right? So that's quantitative testing. And I think qualitative testing is more like journaling, right? So what we always tell people is journal through this process, right? Have some sort of reflective process that helps you to continue to understand what is unfolding. What is happening with this experience? What is changing internally for my experience? And that way, like, you can just sort of like, if you journal 2 or 3 times a week during your microdosing protocol, just look and read through your old journals at the end of your microdosing protocol. What were you saying about yourself in the beginning compared to what you're saying about yourself now? How has that changed? How has your narrative self changed? How has your sense of who you are changed? All of those sorts of things are also ways that we can reevaluate our baseline after microdosing.
Paul, you mentioned I think you're a man of habits and rituals and also like routines, like really positive and powerful routines. What's the Paul Austin personal guide or protocol?
Isra, it's so interesting. For most of my life, I haven't kept a calendar, right? Like I have, right? Like if I have this is in the calendar, our podcast today, or if I have a Zoom call or a meeting, I'll get that in the calendar. But generally, I didn't do a full calendar for my full day. And I started working recently with a coach who basically had me literally create a calendar of everything I'm doing from 7:30 at night to 10:30, or I'm sorry, from 7:30 in the morning when I wake up to 10:30 at night when I start to go to bed. So what I'm going to do is just read you my calendar.
Yes, please.
And then I think that'll give you a sense of how I'm structuring my day. And then I can sort of go into some of the more specifics of how we can combine that with microdosing. So,
Thank you.
First thing when I wake up is my morning routine. I get outside, I go for a walk, I get some sunshine, some vitamin D that helps with my circadian rhythm, just to regulate things. After that, I do a little bit of breath work. So I love Wim Hof breath work, 40 breaths in and out, have the full breath out for a minute or two, have a breath in, do that 3 times. And then I usually go into a little jujitsu yoga movement practice on my yoga mat. So I've been practicing jujitsu lately. So doing some of that, a little bit of yoga, stretch out, some movement in the morning just to get the energy flowing. On a microdose day, I will take my microdose first thing in the morning. So I'll wake up, I'll take a microdose along with probiotics and ashwagandha first thing in the morning. At 8:45, I make some tea, so some oolong tea. I used to be a big coffee drinker and just noticed that when I drank coffee, it made my anxiety quite bad. So I've since switched to oolong tea, which I'm loving a lot more. And from 8:45 to 9:30, I have tea and I journal. And usually I just do stream of consciousness. Maybe I write a few things that I'm grateful for if I've been struggling a little bit. Or sometimes I'll pick a specific prompt from a book that I've read and I'll journal about that prompt. So I wonder that's 8:45 to 9:30. And then from 9:30 to 12 is my creative block for the day. And that's when, the evening before I've queued up my most important task. I put that in to my calendar. So today we were shooting video for the new videos we're shooting for our microdosing course. So I have video shoot from 9:30 to 12, and that's right in there. And then once that's done, I have lunch from 12 to 1. I almost always fast in the morning. So I intermittent fast. I don't eat until 12 every day. I have my meal from 12 to 1. And then throughout the afternoon, I have emails. I have Asana, task management. Today we had a podcast interview. I have sometimes some other calls that I need to check in on. And then in the evening, I do some training or ride my bike, have dinner, wind down for the evening. And that tends to be my routine, my rituals for the day.
Thank you for sharing. And what's been the difference between not having calendar at all and then having that rigorous, self-discipline, knowledgeable calendar and also way of, structuring your day?
I feel a lot less overwhelmed. I think that's the most relevant feeling. Is in the past, since I didn't have everything calendared, I would just be like, oh, after I'm done with this, I can go do this, or I can go do this. And all of a sudden my brain had all these options, had all this optionality. And that led to decision fatigue. I had to decide between doing this or this or this. So in having a calendar, I have a Sunday, task every day from 4 to 5, review and planning. And so with that calendar, with that Sunday review and planning, I literally set my schedule for the week ahead. And that for that, I already know the structure is already there. I don't have to think about what I'm doing. It's just literally like after this, I go to this, after this, I go to this, after this, I go to this. And as long as I'm just following that calendar, generally, I feel a sense of structure and I don't feel like near as overwhelmed. I feel like I can handle and manage things as they are.
Yes.
So that I think is the biggest benefit.
That's really interesting how it sets your tone for the whole of day, for the whole day, like using this sort of routines is so powerful. Paul, what's your thoughts? I mean, you're doing well before COVID, and now maybe we will all do it online, even retreats. But what's your thoughts on psychedelic retreats and peak experiences, which I think go really hand by hand, right?
Absolutely, yeah. A high dose psychedelic experience is a peak experience, just like Burning Man is a peak experience. There are various peak experiences. I go back to the analogy that I hinted at before earlier in the podcast, which is this analogy of going to the dentist. I actually got this. I want to give credit where credit is due. I got this analogy from Martine. Mm-hmm. He was the first one that brought this up when we were actually in Synthesis, starting it off in 2018. And the analogy is basically every 6 months, more or less, we go to the dentist. We get a deep clean, hygienic clean in our mouth, clean it totally out. And then, of course, what the dentist recommends that we do is every day we floss, we brush our teeth, we use mouthwash, we have a practice, we have a ritual to keep the mouth clean. So with psychedelics, breathwork, yoga, microdosing, think of the peak experience as that once every 3 to 6 months experience. It totally blows us out. We get the 50,000 foot perspective on our life. We can see things from the eagle eye. We see how everything is moving together. We see the next, moves that we want to make, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas microdosing and breathwork and yoga and meditation, this is the daily practice of staying clean, of staying present, of integrating the experience. And I think the reason these peak experiences are so important is because they allow us to meditate on what is truly important to us, what really matters to us when we're not caught in the hamster wheel and the distractions of everyday life. I mean, Isra, you're like me. You work hard. You love the work that you do. You probably spend a lot of time and energy in the work that you do because it means so much to you. And you've probably experienced burnout. You've probably experienced anxiety. You've probably experienced, all these sorts of things. Right. And so like when we're in it, when we're in the grind, when we're in it, we don't often have the chance to like really zoom out and have this really kind of broader perspective on things. And that broader perspective on things is so important because again, it allows us to understand what really matters. Do things that feed the ego, that are superficial, that are status oriented, that really don't have any sort of depth to them, do those things really matter at the end of the day? Or do the things that really matter, are they relationships? Are they family? Are they work that we love? Are they, the food that we eat, the way that we meditate, the time that we spend by ourselves, the vacations and the rests that we give ourselves, right? Like that perspective shift is so important now, especially for leaders, because, the predominant sort of narrative for leadership has been to work harder than everyone else. And I think, and it's a very masculine way of leading. It's a very like, we got to get this done. We got to be super productive. We got to, do all those things, which I'll be frank, I love all that shit. And that's burned me out in the past. And so I think really what these peak experiences can help us to do is to integrate this professional perspective of I want to produce, I want to create, I want to provide value to others. And I also need to nurture myself and take care of myself and slow down and be present. I need to find that point of integration.
But you don't get to see this while you are in the grind, right? Grinding. You get to see this when you retreat into yourself, and when you retreat in a place when you can get this distance, this eagle eye, and then you go with a deeper experience or a peak experience through, psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD, right?
Right, because when we're sort of on the ground, needing to deal with everything and, respond to everything and handle email and communicate to the team and all that sort of stuff, we're more reactive. We're more like, we need to be here. We don't get that chance to like unwind ourselves. So that's why retreats are so important and so necessary. It's a container of rest and restoration and regeneration. And why I love psychedelics in that container is because psychedelics are such a potent catalyst to see significant shifts in a short period of time. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, we need that break from the everyday reality so we can actually have the perspectives of what do we actually want to be doing with our time and our energy, what really matters to us. And, if we were to die, this is such a cliche these days, but if we were to die next week or, next month, would we be really satisfied with the way that we've chosen to live our lives up until this point in time? And I think that's a really important indicator.
Amen. How does links with I found a really interesting concept in your website, which is stewarding humanity. How does it links with this? How to be as the steward of humanity? So because I found this really interesting, I wanted to ask you about this.
That's a great question. So the concept of stewardship. Is I think a concept that might be rooted in religion and Christianity in terms of serving the church and serving God, but it's also become much more relevant in the ecological movement. How are we stewards of the earth? How are we stewards of the land around us? How can we make sure that we take care of it, that it's there for future generations, right? And that's what I think about. Like, what is humanity's future generation? And what work can we do now to help ensure that the next generation of humanity 2.0, which I think is sort of an integration of artificial intelligence and the humanness that we know and that we love. How can we make sure that there's that we've created a beautiful sort of way for them to live? And I think in particular, what I'm interested in is how can psychedelics help with that process? How can psychedelics help individuals globally to heal their wounds, to heal their trauma, to heal the things that plague them and that cause suffering and create suffering? And through that process of transformation, how can those individuals, as we're healing and transforming, go out and serve in creating and building this new, I would say, culture more than anything, right? This regenerative economy. The way, having these principles of interconnectedness, which we learn from psychedelics, how can we integrate those into our work? Like I was talking about at the beginning of the podcast, how can we integrate our professional pursuits with our personal values, right? So as more and more people wake up
That's key.
to who they are, wake up to, well, this corporate job, I mean, I get a good paycheck, but fuck that shit. It's stealing my soul. How can I make sure that I can actually do things that mean so much to me and bring them out into the world and really gift them, right? I think of gifting a lot. When we steward something, it's a gift. We expect nothing in return, but this is a gift of what we're giving to ensure that humanity can thrive in the future.
That's a really powerful concept, and I love the idea of gifting. And because like gifting is generosity, and generosity is a human gift that changes the giver and the receiver, change everyone. It's so powerful. Paul, what's been because you've been on leading positions since really young on third wave synthesis, like in your speaking career, publishing now, consultant, coach. What's been your most significant learning about leadership?
So a little over a year ago, little timeline. 2015, I started Third Wave. 2018, I started Synthesis. So throughout all of 2018, I was building Third Wave and building Synthesis, and essentially burned out, stretched myself too thin. So at the end of 2018, early 2019, I had a team of maybe 10 people for Third Wave, and the majority of them quit because of some internal dialogue and conflict and disagreements. And I think for me, the biggest lesson from that I learned about leadership was that I have to take care of myself, that I have to nourish myself, that I have to be okay, and I have to be healthy, because especially in a leadership position, that energy permeates through everything that I do. So because my main focus right now is still third wave in the team and all that, then the energy that I feel is going to go into third wave as an organization. So I think the biggest lesson that I've learned is just to be mindful of how I feel. To be mindful of, am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling depressed? Do I feel balanced? Do I feel centered? Do I feel grounded? And anytime I'm not feeling centered or balanced or grounded, there needs to be a significant sort of check-in on, okay, well, what's going on? What needs to change? How do I kind of refine my center point? So I think that for me has been so far the biggest lesson in leadership is how much my energy permeates everything around me, because that, I just wasn't mindful of it before that happened with the whole team situation.
Because in order to take care of the others, you have to take care of yourself first, right? And then the more you love yourself, the more you will be able to love everyone.
And I think sometimes, and I'll speak for myself, I'm so driven and focused on, I want to help. I want to create something of value. I want to build assets. I want to, make sure people on my team are taken care of, make sure that, things feel good for them. And oftentimes, we forget that, well, you can do all that, but if it's not 50-50, then it's a lost game at that point.
And Paul, you've been also involved really involved on creativity, and you've been exposed to creativity inside of your projects and in your life, and also with the clients and that you've been working with in your consultancy, in your courses. So what's the biggest lessons from in creativity you've experienced?
I think one, creativity requires commitment. To consistently show up as a creative force requires commitment to the creative work. And creativity is something that we get better at over time. I think it's a skill, just like anything else. The ability to be creative. I think the other thing goes back to what we were just talking about before, that the only way we can be really creative and in our creative force is by taking care of ourselves and by resting and by, spending time restoring ourselves, because we're most creative when we feel totally balanced and centered. And if we're anxious or depressed, then that's just going to throw everything off. So we need to always, maintain a sense of balance and poise, and that will help the creativity to really flourish.
So interesting that it leads me to a question that arises here, and it's you talk at the very beginning on the first response you gave me in the first question. So how to access, because creativity comes from, you were saying that when you started with LSD microdosing, you were, one of the biggest effects it was that you were entering in flow states much easier and from bigger and longer periods of time. If I recall well. So what will be your put simple, of course, because it can get you for a long of time, for longer. How to access flow states more easily?
I think the most important thing to do is pay attention to the work that you're doing. It's impossible to enter flow if you're not really engaged and loved at the work that you're doing. And it's not a little bit challenging. So the work, has to be a little bit challenging. It has to be something that you love doing, and you have to have basically no distractions. So that's why, for example, this morning every morning I have this creative block where I'm doing, just the video shoot, or just, working on writing scripts or working on a book. And for that reason, I'll microdose that morning. I'll have no distractions. I'll ensure that obviously it's something that I love to do, and it has to be a little bit difficult. There has to be some sort of energy pulling me forward. And I think those are the three most important things to pay attention to when it comes to really facilitating flow.
Paul, is flow state tied with the peak performance? And because I know you work also on peak performance, and what will be the requirements to get into peak performance state?
I think flow is a part of peak performance. Creativity is a part of peak performance. Productivity is a part of peak performance. I think flow is probably the best embodiment or representation of peak performance, because when we want to perform at a high level, then getting into a flow state is the most effective way to do that. So I think flow is an absolute precursor to peak performance. You can't perform at a high level unless you're in a flow state.
And last but not lastly, we are getting in deep into rapid fire questions, which is the last part of
Perfect.
the podcast. Thank you for also sharing this, all your knowledge and experience with us. And Paul, first question is, what's the most interesting question you've been asked?
Who am I?
And what's been your biggest learning ever?
When I took LSD for the first time.
What's your most prominent failure?
When my entire team quit at the third wave, the initial team, we had 8 people quit. And so I had to rebuild everything from that point, which we did and was fine, but everyone quit. That was hard.
And the most interesting success you've had?
Being featured in Forbes was interesting, having a 3 to 4 page article. And that came from the conference I spoke at where I met our mutual friend, Eric, which was a conference in Switzerland that Stephen Kotler keynoted, and I spoke right after Stephen. So I would say probably that conference was the most fun thing of all of this so far.
Your toughest challenge?
Staying balanced and present every day. That's the toughest challenge.
What's the book you've recommended the most?
Walden by Thoreau.
Sorry, I was closing the window because I was getting turned sick. Can you repeat, please?
Yep, Walden by Henry David Thoreau.
And what's the podcast you listen the most?
Sam Harris.
Your most valuable item?
My journal.
And what's the thought that you have when you wake up that repeats the most?
Ooh. I gotta raise the blinds. I gotta get the sun in my room as soon as possible. That's usually the thought.
And the thing you like the most?
Food.
What's
bacon.
your favorite?
Bacon specifically.
you were. I was going to ask you this that you were saying before that I even asked bacon.
Yeah.
Paul, just we hitting now is the end, and the last question I want to ask you is, what will be the final message you want to share with us? If I'm gonna ask you that, so you'll be asked. What will be your final message to everyone who is listening the podcast?
That personal responsibility and taking ownership over our health and well-being is the most important thing that we can do. And that psychedelics, when used with intention and responsibility, are, they're one of the most potent tools to catalyze that shift in how we take ownership over our well-being and our health and everything like that.
Paul, where can we find you on the internet?
So thethirdwave.co for more information on microdosing and psychedelics. paulaustin.co is my personal website. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram at paulaustin3w.
And can we get information from your online courses in Third Wave and in your website?
Yes. Yep. That's all there.
Also the book, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add, Paul?
No, this is great, Isra. Thank you so much for your questions and everything. This was fantastic.
Let me tell you, it's been really, really, really interesting. I have four full pages written down with the, quotes, questions, and also a lot of learnings and lessons that I will share with the listeners and with a lot of people in the post and the social networks. Paul, thank you for creating light in this world, opening the door to a tool that when, as you said, is used responsibly and with awareness, can heal and do so much good for everyone, for the world, and for people which is wounded, people which is in depression, people which wants to improve in their lives. And thank you for being that steward on the humanity. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for contributing and being in Disrupting Everything podcast series.
Thank you, Isra. It was an honor to be on the show, and I really appreciate everything that you're doing with Disrupt Everything and lifestyle design, and I think it's beautiful. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone who is listening to this podcast. You've listened Paul Austin on this intersection between psychedelics, leadership, creativity, flow state, pre-performance, and creating a better humanity. So remember, if you don't disrupt yourself, you will be disrupted, and the last thing will be more painful than the first one. So go ahead, take the lead, and create action, forward motion. Be disruptive, don't be disrupted. This is Isra García, and you're listening to Disrupt Everything podcast series.
Esto ha sido Disrupt Everything by Isra García. Encuentra el riesgo antes de que el riesgo te encuentre a ti.